The first sound that morning was not music or church bells. It was engines, low, patient, and heavy, rolling in through a city that had run out of patience months ago. 19-year-old Ilse Hartmann stood beside a cellar door in Wiesbaden, fingers pressed white to the flaked paint, and waited for a shape to step out of the noise and match the picture the radio had hammered into her mind. The picture was simple. Monsters. Monsters with dark faces and greedy hands. Monsters who would take what they wanted because that, the voice had said, was their nature. It was a neat story for a war that had stopped being neat. Then the first American truck came into view, olive drab and streaked with a winter that had not been kind to anyone. A tank followed, low and mean, turret tracking across the street like a patient animal, its hull painted with a black panther that looked like motion itself. The men on it wore the same indifferent gray of exhaustion as every soldier Ilse had ever seen. Only their faces were not what she had been taught to expect from liberators or from enemies. They were black Americans, tankers of the 761st, black Panthers, moving with a discipline that made the clatter of their tracks seem less like threat and more like a metronome in a room where time had been drunk and staggering. Ilse's neighbor, an old woman who had survived 2 wars by boiling everything down to rules, whispered, "Do not look at them. Do not speak unless spoken to." Ilse looked anyway. A sergeant on the lead tank, his shoulders squared by more than just his jacket, raised a hand and signaled the driver to idle. 2 men slid off the rear deck with the kind of clean economy that comes from having done a thing too many times. They did not kick doors. They did not point rifles at children. One posted himself at the corner bakery, palm out, voice calm, telling the little crowd of thin faces that there would be bread, but it would be handed out fairly. The other walked down the street with a medic's bag looped to his shoulder, stopping at doorways where the watchers were older, coughs harsher, faces gray with a winter spent in cellars. He asked questions in slow English that made sense even when the words did not. Pain, fever, eat, drink, while a boy with a pistol on his belt and an MP band on his arm followed, taking notes, pointing men back when they tried to skip the line, insisting in a voice that carried that payment would be made for anything the soldiers took. It was not a show. It was not even kindness as a performance. It was procedure, a ritual of control that kept hunger from curing itself with theft and fear from turning into a crowd. Years of Nazi radio dissolved like sugar in hot tea. Propaganda works best on empty stomachs. It had told Ilse that black American soldiers were dangerous, lustful, ungovernable. She had believed it because belief cost nothing compared to doubt. And doubt had become a luxury. Now the men standing in front of her did something worse than contradict the lie. They made it look ridiculous. A tanker with a grease-slicked wrench tightened a loose fender bolt, and then used the same wrench to knock on the bakery's wooden door. 2 polite raps that sounded like an old neighbor asking to borrow a pan. Another soldier passed tins down from the truck, rations and a crate stamped with a red cross, while a third spoke with the baker in a kitchen that smelled like flour and old fear. Ilse realized, with a suddenness that felt like shedding a coat, that she was watching a story end. Not a war. Wars end with papers and salutes, but a small, constant narrative about who she should be frightened of and who was allowed to be human. She had been told dangerous. She saw young men whose discipline made a narrow street wider. The sergeant's voice came across, soft as a wave. "Nobody runs. Everybody eats." The words were English. The meaning was universal. The monsters were not the men in front of her. The monsters were the stories that had kept her from seeing them. By the time the second truck parked, the ritual had spread the way procedures do when led by someone who expects to be obeyed. A guard took up station at the rear alley. No looters, no backdoor deals, and the MP split his attention between the bakery queue and a small knot of men who had shown up with a handcart and a private market already flickering in their eyes. He told them, with the weight of a man who has been told no more times than he can count and is still here, that there would be payment, receipts, and nowhere for stolen goods to go. When one of the men laughed and made a joke about requisition, the MP shook his head and pointed at a sheet of paper clipped to his notebook. "Orders," he said, tapping the signature lines. "Not requisition, payment. And if someone takes without paying, you bring me a name." It had a different effect than Ilse expected from someone wearing a pistol. People stopped trying to bend the exchange and started to believe that food might change hands without the world curdling around the transaction. The medic's rounds felt like a soft rebellion against the winter. He crouched by a doorway, where a man in a threadbare coat described a pain he could not quite name, and pressed the back of his hand to the man's forehead. He opened his bag, passed over small miracles, sulfa powder in a twist of paper, a clean bandage, a bar of soap, and wrote something in a little book that supported memory. He asked if there were children in the cellar. He asked if any old people had fallen. He asked if anyone still had a cough that did not quit at night. Where Ilse had expected voices that boomed, there were voices that kept to the size of a room. Where she had expected boots that hunted, there were boots that learned to make less noise on a cracked stair. At the bakery, the guard's posture did the math that every hungry crowd does. How much bread is inside, how many mouths are outside, how quickly order becomes rumor, becomes rush, becomes broken glass and empty shelves. He let the line move steady. He told a woman with a baby to go ahead of a man who tried to push past, and then took the man aside and made him a helper, a translator, an extra pair of hands to set rolls into paper sleeves. The transformation took the sting out of the shove. Ilse watched the girl who had been her friend before the war. Magda of the braid, Magda of the laugh in class when a question was too hard. Walk up to the counter shaking like a leaf, and walk away with a loaf and 2 small chocolate bars, one of which she slipped to the guard, and one she tucked, smiling, into her coat for a younger brother. The guard did not take the gift. He told her with that same serious calm that he could not accept gifts on duty. "Your brother will like both," he said, and smiled not like a man given contraband, but like an uncle approving of forethought. There was no single moment when Ilse switched sides. There were 100 small ones. The way the tankers kept their voices low when they talked to people crouched in doorways. The way the MP wrote receipts for things so ordinary it felt like a joke. Eggs, flour, a dented kettle, and then made the joke himself. "Don't worry, ma'am. It's an ugly kettle. I'm doing you a favor." And then paid anyway. The way the medic looked at an old woman's hands and asked if they hurt when she kneaded dough, as if he had thought about bread before bullets that morning. The way the tank's engine idled like a big cat breathing, power leashed and ready but not prowling. She had been told to be afraid for years. She realized fear had kept her from noticing what it looks like when people behave as if rules matter in a place that has run out of rules. News travels through streets the way wind finds an alley. By afternoon, people were saying the words Black Panthers, the way they might say the name of a local team gone famous, carefully, with a small weight of awe. Someone had heard that the unit had fought in France and Belgium, that they had taken towns where the maps had expected them to stop, and that their path into Germany had been earned one field at a time. Ilse did not know where such facts lived. She knew only the shape they made in her head. These were veterans, and whatever the radio had said they were also men who had done a hard job longer than anyone should have to do it. Much later, she would learn the proper nouns and the straight lines, France, Belgium, the push toward the Rhine. And she would add to them the italicized truth that disciplines like the one she was watching do not grow in a day. They are built by long practice, by leaders who insist that the rules apply even when it stains your pride, and by soldiers who carry double burdens without putting them down on someone else's doorstep. The double burden was obvious, even if you had no words for its history. The men who stood guard at the bakery wore American patches and carried American rifles. They were also segregated from other Americans. Their billets would be separate, their promotions would climb slower ladders. Their mistakes would be judged by more eyes and remembered longer. Their victories would be rebadged as exceptions to rules written by people who did not know their names. They were asked to fight for a freedom that did not greet them with the same warmth it gave to other uniforms. That contradiction made the quiet, fair line in front of the bakery feel larger than a civic act. It was a statement. We will be professional even when the world declines to be fair. It shamed Ilse's expectations, but it also humbled something else in the street. The part of any crowd that wants to see someone with a gun turn into the story that makes crowds feel right about their fear. Someone said the unit had a motto, "Come out fighting," and the words fit the posture of the tank at the corner. Gun silent, engine hot, crew alert, a readiness held under control like a boxer's hands inches from his own chest. To come out fighting, and then to stand still and distribute bread with a ledger and a receipt book, required a discipline that you do not fake for long. Men who had sprinted across fields under fire were now deliberately slowing themselves down so that a city would learn to breathe. Ilse found herself believing in a sentence she would have laughed at the day before. Calm is a kind of courage. It is also contagious. Neighbors who had been watching from windows began to come down to the street. Hands appeared from cellar doors. A violin made of cheap wood was carried out of one house and leaned against a stoop as if music might decide to try itself again in public. The tankers did not rush it. They made the street safe enough for it to seem like an idea. What survives of a day like that fits into small containers. A receipt folded into the seam of an apron, a cigarette stubbed out on a step and later kept as if smoke could be stored. A chocolate wrapper smoothed and slipped into a book because the smell hung on the paper and changed the way the page turned. Ilse's neighbor kept a crumpled piece of paper that said, in English letters she could barely read, that an American military policeman had paid for 2 sacks of flour. She would show it to anyone who doubted what she had seen. A boy traded a cigarette for a carved wooden horse that had belonged to the boy who lived next door. The soldier who made the trade tucked the horse into his bag, with a care that suggested he carried more fragile things every day, and had decided to carry this one as well. A medic passed a sulfa packet through a cellar window and told the family inside that infection was faster than fear and less interesting to argue with. So use this and do not wait. He said it with a tired humor that made a father laugh in a room where no one had laughed in months. The quiet achievements were as real as the thunderous ones men write in their diaries. Patrols kept looters from mistaking liberation for a free-for-all. When a shopkeeper accused a soldier of taking a wristwatch without paying, the MPs came, listened, and marched the man back to his unit. The commander called him out in a voice that carried down the block and made the air feel colder. Punishment followed, immediate, humiliating, public enough to serve the lesson, and private enough to keep it from turning into a parade. Ilse remembered the silence around that moment not as fear, but as recognition. Power was correcting itself. No one said it out loud, but everyone heard the sentence as if it had been spoken. The rules apply to everyone in uniform. A woman who had hidden in a cellar for half of a year came up afterward and placed a little biscuit on the step near the MP's boot, not as a bribe, but as a thank you that would not embarrass either of them. At the bakery, the line moved. Bread came out, crust torn by hands that had not held anything warm at dawn in a long season. A tank crewman took a moment to kneel and tie a child's boot because the laces had frayed into threads. The child stood still, like a small animal being fitted for a harness, with a patience it did not know it had. When the knot was tied, the soldier put the loose ends into the boot so they could not trip the child. He did it expertly, like someone who had tied too many things in motion: lines, cables, tourniquets, wounds. Ilse watched this with a feeling she could not name, and later would. The sudden, embarrassing rush of grief that comes when kindness appears after you have run out of plans for how to survive without it. It was tempting to let the day stay small. Streets prefer their own scale. But the men on those tanks carried with them miles of other streets and fields, places where calm had not been possible, and the ledger had been a different kind of book. The 761st had ground through towns in France, where the houses were missing teeth, through Belgian lanes that froze solid and refused to be roads, and into Germany, where the lines on maps men drew in classrooms became fields that killed them in careful, indifferent ways. Their discipline had been forged in battalion orders, and in the smaller orders you whisper to yourself when a leader is not looking. Do not break. Do not give anyone the satisfaction of saying you broke. If the army makes you wait twice as long for half a stripe because of who you are, do the job in front of you twice as well and save your anger for after the shooting stops. It is an unfair rule. They kept it anyway. In Italy, the 92nd Infantry Division dug into hills that looked like postcards and fought in valleys whose names tourists would buy later. The postcards did not show the mud that turned men into statues, or the margins that kept those men from promotion boards. They did not show billets where a soldier could share a foxhole with someone he would not be allowed to share a lunch counter with back home. They did not show the bone-deep fatigue that is not only from marching, but from knowing that when the general comes to pin a medal on a chest, he might choose a different chest for reasons that would not pass a fair test in any court. And yet patrols went out on time. Bridges were blown or taken as orders required. Boys who looked like they had not yet outgrown a bicycle helmet learned to read a map at night by the texture of the paper under their fingers, and to listen for a click underfoot that would end a life. The contradiction of fighting for freedom abroad while hauling shackles of custom at home did not resolve. It sharpened. The men learned to carry it without letting it poison how they behaved toward civilians, who had been told to fear them for reasons that echoed but were not the same. When Ilse later learned that the 92nd had fought under the nickname Buffalo Soldiers, she laughed at the way names keep histories inside them like seeds. A buffalo is a patient animal until it is not. A panther is a quiet animal until it moves. In both cases, the power is not in noise, but in control. She told a cousin, years later, that the thing she remembered most from that day in Wiesbaden was not the tanks. It was the way a man in an MP band checked a receipt against a crate, and then looked up with an expression that had no room for revenge in it. "Professional," she said, tasting the word like a piece of hard candy. They were professional, and I had been taught to expect the opposite. If you want to know how a day like that is made, you could read occupation orders. They do not speak in music. They speak in bullet points. Guard public utilities, secure food distribution, treat civilians with respect, pay for goods, enforce curfews without cruelty, disarm without humiliation, punish misconduct, report violations, show receipts. Then you could read unit diaries where the bullets pick up fingerprints. Posted guard at bakery, line formed without incident, issued chits for flour. MP instructed baker to keep 2 loaves for hospital. You could read letters home where the bullets turn into sentences and the tone changes. Mama, you would not believe the lies they were told about us, and you would not believe how fast a thing falls apart when the truth walks in wearing boots. Somewhere in the margin of those documents lives the person who made the decision that morning to post a guard at the bread line before posting one at the bank. It was a choice of priorities that said the right way to make a city quiet is to feed it, and the right way to feed it is to show your work. Commanders set the tone by what they punished. Someone caught a man trying to take a ring from a table while the family was outside, and the response was instant. A company commander stood a man up, took his weapon, and spoke in front of the platoon about how they were not thieves, that they would not become what the posters had promised, that they were here to fight soldiers, not to raid trinkets from people who had been lied to by professionals. He made the man return the ring with an apology that was not allowed to sound like a grin. He wrote it up. He sent it up. He did it because he understood that civilians were watching, and because soldiers were watching each other. The next day, the rumor that had started to snake through the market about theft had nowhere to go. It died for lack of oxygen. You could say that was good public relations. It was also good soldiering. The diaries keep small moments that no headquarters would think to order. A tanker swapped a pack of cigarettes for a pair of wool socks because he had not been warm since November. A medic slipped a sulfa packet under a cellar door and told the mother behind it that the powder would do more good than another prayer. An MP told a baker to keep receipts like relics, because there would be arguments later about what was taken, and he wanted her to win them. The men wrote about the cold, about the food, about tired engines and broken tracks. But when they wrote about civilians, the tone shifted. It grew courtly, as if having been treated as less by their own army had made them stubborn about treating others as if they mattered. It is a paradox only if you have never watched dignity reproduce under pressure. It would be easy to stop there and craft a tidy moral that professionalism conquers prejudice in a single afternoon, that discipline is a switch anyone can throw, that kindness walks into a ruined street and the clock resets to 0. It would also be a lie. Behind the scene Ilse watched were scenes she could not see. Mess halls with separate tables, billets divided by habit and by order, promotion boards where a man's file was weighed on scales that had been calibrated by a century of other men's faces, jokes told in rooms you entered by the wrong door and then could not leave quickly enough. In the same week that a lieutenant wrote an order about receipts and respect, a private read a letter from home about a bus seat he would not be allowed to take when he visited on leave. The contradiction made some men bitter. It made others stubborn in a different direction. They wore their discipline like a uniform under the uniform and refused to let the world draw them to its level. The human stakes were messy. A soldier who had slept 3 hours in 2 days might snap at a man who asked him a question he could not answer. A boy who had lost a brother at the Bulge might stop pretending to care about a shopkeeper's story, because grief makes the ear hard for a time. A commander who had learned to tolerate a certain kind of rage in his men because it got them across a field might struggle to teach them how to shut the valve in a street where attention would be the only armor they had. There were fights in barracks. There were grievances filed and ignored. There were smart, angry letters that began, "Sir," and ended respectfully, that were neither ignored nor answered, simply buried under new orders with names of new towns in their headers. And still the next day, a guard stood at a bakery and kept the line steady. Duty is often what survives when ideals are tired. Ilse did not know any of this in words. She sensed it the way you sense a storm by smell. That the calm in front of her was not a gift from the sky, but a choice humans were making with their backs and eyes and hands. Later, reading, she would learn the names of institutions and the numbers of court cases and the dates of marches, and she would feel the humility of realizing that the scene that saved her from believing in monsters had been acted by men who had to fight their own monsters in rooms she had never entered. The tidy heroics were for posters. The real story was a long, hard stubbornness that turned men into the kind of people who could hand out bread without letting anyone push past a woman with a baby. Late in the afternoon, when the light in the street had settled into the honey color that makes broken windows look like they might forgive you, Ilse gathered the courage to speak. She chose the MP because he had the kind of face you ask for directions from when you are lost. "Do you always do this?" she asked in German, then in halting English. He smiled with one corner of his mouth and tilted his head. "Do what?" "Pay," she said, tapping the notebook, feeling foolish for making a question out of something so obvious and so new. "Yes," he said, matter of fact. "Orders, also right." She nodded as if some lever in the world had clicked into place. "Radio said," she began, and then she did not know which lie to choose because there had been so many. "Radio say a lot," he said. "You listen with your eyes today." It could have sounded like a rebuke. It did not. It sounded like an invitation to start again with better tools. At the corner, a tanker whose hands were permanently stained with the dark half-moons of engine grease cleaned his wrench with a rag until the metal shone. Ilse asked if the panther on the hull meant something, and he told her the nickname and the motto, and the pieces of the route that could be told to a stranger who might become a friend. He asked her name. He told her his, Mason, and it sounded to Ilse like a word that made houses. She told him that she had been told to be afraid of him since she was 15. He told her that he had been told to be careful with her since he was born. It was not a joke. It was also not an accusation. It was a small bridge laid plank by plank, and when she stepped onto it, she felt how wobbly and necessary it was. A boy from the crowd shyly offered Mason a wooden toy plane with a missing propeller. Mason took it like a church object and made a small show of turning the stub as if a blade might grow out of courteous attention. He gave the boy a stick of gum he had been saving. The exchange had no price on it. It had weight anyway. Later, when the trucks revved and the tank moved again, Ilse watched the plane disappear into a soldier's bag and believed, with a child's certainty that had survived the winter, that it would be fixed by someone who fixes things. On the windowsill, someone placed a cup of weak coffee for the MP. He did not drink on duty. He lifted it after his relief came and made a little toast toward the window, as if the city itself had offered it. The reports that came up from other towns sounded like siblings to Ilse's day. In a village in Italy, a patrol from the 92nd found a church being tugged apart by people who had decided that the statues and the candlesticks might be a better kind of currency than their own fear. The sergeant posted 2 guards and walked the rest of the patrol through the pews, asking whose grandmother had been baptized here, whose father had been married here, whose brother had sung here. By the time he finished, the looting had become a cleanup party. In a market in Belgium, a truck from the 761st stopped at the edge of a line that was already a fight. The MP got out and did the same thing Ilse had seen. Receipts, chits, money, a line that bent not to force, but to a ledger. In a German town not far from Wiesbaden, someone tried to make a poster that called the Black American soldiers animals. The poster did not last an hour, not because soldiers tore it down, but because the man who put it up saw a medic kneel to check a child's fever and felt ashamed of the paper in his hand. Propaganda collapses 2 ways: loudly in courtrooms and quietly in kitchens. The quiet collapse is the most durable. A radio can be turned up again, a law can be written again, a speech can be given with the timbre of a voice that makes liars sound brave. But when a woman sees a man with a rifle count her coins and write a receipt and nod to her like a partner in a small, temporary enterprise called survival, it is hard to teach her to be afraid of his shadow again. When a boy watches a tank crewman tie his bootlaces and then wave him past in the bread line, the word monster becomes a joke, and then a slur, and then a fossil. The stories that had been told about Black American soldiers required loudness and distance. The truth required only proximity and time. the men supplied both with patience that had been trained into them for reasons too complicated and unjust to explain on a sidewalk. In the evenings that spring, Ilse would hear music from a house 2 streets over, the careful plucking of a guitar trying to remember songs that had slept underground during the last year. She would think of the panther painted on the tank, and the buffalo she had read about later, and the way animals carry meaning in their bodies without needing language. She would decide, in a way that surprised her, that she wanted to learn the English word for a thing she had always thought of in German: neighbor. The dictionary would give her the right one. The street had given her the definition long before. Years later, Ilse told her children that the day the trucks came into Wiesbaden did not make her a different person in an instant. What it did was steal a crutch from her thinking. Whenever a lazy prejudice tried to sit down in the chair in her head that said, "monsters," it found the chair already occupied by a memory of a man in an MP band insisting on paying for flour, of a medic who asked about hands that hurt from kneading, of a tanker who listened to a girl pronounce "professional" like a new spice, and took it as if it were a medal he could actually use. She kept the receipt until the paper browned, and the ink turned into a faint bruise across the fibers. She put it between pages of a cookbook because it belonged there, under a list of ingredients next to a recipe for bread. For the men whose names she never knew, the legacy was less sentimental and more structural. They measured success by mornings that came after nights with no trouble, by reports that said, "no incidents," with the satisfaction of men who have seen too many, by small changes that crept into orders after a pattern of good behavior made a case that could survive a staff meeting. They knew that in their own country the ledger would still be uneven. They also knew, perhaps with a bitterness that did not need to be confessed to be real, that the day might come when the same professionalism would have to be used to make their own streets safe from the same kind of lies. It is a strange inheritance to earn in another nation's alley under a painted panther and a promise. On the last night before the 761st moved on, Ilse stood at her window with the lights out and watched the tank crews check their engines. A soldier walked past and saw her shadow and gave a small wave that breakable things give one another when they are still standing. She did not wave back. She put her hand on the glass and felt the cold and thought of the bakery line, the notebook, the careful money, the way everyone's breath had smoked like factory chimneys, and the way the day had still been warm. The trucks started. The engines answered. The street remembered with a shiver what power felt like when it did not need to shout. In the cellar behind her, the toy airplane with the missing propeller had been replaced with one that spun when you blew on it. The boy had gone to sleep with the gum wrapper under his pillow, convinced that sweetness could be stored in paper. If you ask what changed that day, the answer is small and sufficient. Eyes. Propaganda painted monsters. Reality announced professionals. The difference was not in speeches or proclamations, though those would come. It was in a hand that did not take without counting, a voice that did not rise when it could carry the same distance soft, a choice to set a guard at a bakery before posting one at a bank. In the world's big ledger, those are small entries. In the street where Ilse learned to stand and watch and believe her own eyes, they were everything. Years later, when someone tried to tell her a story about people she did not know, she would say, "Let me see them work." It was the only test that mattered after a year, when offerings had been made to the god of loud lies. The men who passed her window had answered with order, restraint, and the kind of everyday courage that makes liberation real. The monsters had been shadows. The humans were busy. That was enough to remember and enough to teach. There is a detail that hides in the seams of that week and makes sense of its quiet power. Procedure is immoral, not because paperwork is holy, but because in a vacuum of trust, ritualized fairness is the only language strangers can share at speed. A receipt is a bridge. A posted guard at a bakery is a sentence that says, "We will not let hunger choose violence today." A medic's sulfa packet is an argument made with powder and paper against the idea that some lives are background. When Black American soldiers enforced those rituals in a city that had been taught to fear them, they did more than calm a street. They altered the grammar of authority for the eyes that watched. They took the loudest weapon propaganda wields, anticipation of cruelty, and turned it into a theatrical prop that no longer fit the scene. The script had to be rewritten, not with speeches, but with lines of people waiting their turn under the supervision of men who had every reason to hate drama and had chosen to love order instead. There is a detail that hides in the seams of that week and makes sense of its quiet power. Procedure is immoral, not because paperwork is holy, but because in a vacuum of trust, ritualized fairness is the only language strangers can share at speed. A receipt is a bridge. A posted guard at a bakery is a sentence that says, "We will not let hunger choose violence today." A medic's sulfa packet is an argument made with powder and paper against the idea that some lives are background. When Black American soldiers enforced those rituals in a city that had been taught to fear them, they did more than calm a street. They altered the grammar of authority for the eyes that watched. They took the loudest weapon propaganda wields, anticipation of cruelty, and turned it into a theatrical prop that no longer fit the scene. The script had to be rewritten, not with speeches, but with lines of people waiting their turn under the supervision of men who had every reason to hate drama and had chosen to love order instead. There is a detail that hides in the seams of that week and makes sense of its quiet power. Procedure is immoral, not because paperwork is holy, but because in a vacuum of trust, ritualized fairness is the only language strangers can share at speed. A receipt is a bridge. A posted guard at a bakery is a sentence that says, "We will not let hunger choose violence today." A medic's sulfa packet is an argument made with powder and paper against the idea that some lives are background. When Black American soldiers enforced those rituals in a city that had been taught to fear them, they did more than calm a street. They altered the grammar of authority for the eyes that watched. They took the loudest weapon propaganda wields, anticipation of cruelty, and turned it into a theatrical prop that no longer fit the scene. The script had to be rewritten, not with speeches, but with lines of people waiting their turn under the supervision of men who had every reason to hate drama and had chosen to love order instead. There is a detail that hides in the seams of that week and makes sense of its quiet power. Procedure is immoral, not because paperwork is holy, but because in a vacuum of trust, ritualized fairness is the only language strangers can share at speed. A receipt is a bridge. A posted guard at a bakery is a sentence that says, "We will not let hunger choose violence today." A medic's sulfa packet is an argument made with powder and paper against the idea that some lives are background. When Black American soldiers enforced those rituals in a city that had been taught to fear them, they did more than calm a street. They altered the grammar of authority for the eyes that watched. They took the loudest weapon propaganda wields, anticipation of cruelty, and turned it into a theatrical prop that no longer fit the scene. The script had to be rewritten, not with speeches, but with lines of people waiting their turn under the supervision of men who had every reason to hate drama and had chosen to love order instead. There is a detail that hides in the seams of that week and makes sense of its quiet power. Procedure is immoral. Not because paperwork is holy, but because in a vacuum of trust, ritualized fairness is the only language strangers can share at speed. A receipt is a bridge. A posted guard at a bakery is a sentence that says, "We will not let hunger choose violence today." A medic's sulfa packet is an argument made with powder and paper against the idea that some lives are background. When Black American soldiers enforced those rituals in a city that had been taught to fear them, they did more than calm a street. They altered the grammar of authority for the eyes that watched. They took the loudest weapon propaganda wields, anticipation of cruelty, and turned it into a theatrical prop that no longer fit the scene. The script had to be rewritten, not with speeches, but with lines of people waiting their turn under the supervision of men who had every reason to hate drama and had chosen to love order instead. There is a detail that hides in the seams of that week and makes sense of its quiet power. Procedure is immoral, not because paperwork is holy, but because in a vacuum of trust, ritualized fairness is the only language strangers can share at speed. A receipt is a bridge. A posted guard at a bakery is a sentence that says, "We will not let hunger choose violence today." A medic's sulfa packet is an argument made with powder and paper against the idea that some lives are background. When Black American soldiers enforced those rituals in a city that had been taught to fear them, they did more than calm a street. They altered the grammar of authority for the eyes that watched. They took the loudest weapon propaganda wields, anticipation of cruelty, and turned it into a theatrical prop that no longer fit the scene. The script had to be rewritten, not with speeches but with lines of people waiting their turn under the supervision of men who had every reason to hate drama and had chosen to love order instead.